For the purpose of this story, you can call me Evan. A couple years ago, my routine was extremely predictable. I worked a pretty standard office job, doing IT support for a logistics company. Nothing exciting. I'd get in around 8, spend most of the day fixing printer issues or resetting passwords, and leave around 5. After work, I'd go straight to the gym. The gym was the one part of my day that actually felt like it belonged to me. Same time every evening. Same basic split. Same playlist in my headphones. It wasn't some hardcore bodybuilding gym either. Just a local place in a strip mall that stayed open late and had enough equipment that you rarely had to wait for anything. If you go to the same gym long enough, you start recognizing the regulars. Not in a we're friends kind of way, but in that silent acknowledgement way. The nod when you walk past each other. The quick half smile when you both reach for the same rack of dumbbells. Everyone sort of keeps to themselves, but you're aware of each other. One of the regulars was a guy named Trevor. At least, that's the name he gave me. Trevor looked like someone who took the gym very seriously. Always wearing fitted athletic shirts, always carrying a big black gym bag, and always walking around with a shaker bottle like it was glued to his hand. He had a pretty muscular build and usually kept his headphones around his neck rather than on his ears, like he wanted to be available for conversation. At first, we just did the normal gym acknowledgement. The head nodded, passing each other between sets. Then, one evening, I was setting up for bench press, and he was already on the bench next to mine. When he saw me loading plates, he pulled off his headphones and said, "Hey man, you mind spotting me real quick?" That's a pretty normal request in a gym, so I said sure. I stood behind the bench while he unracked the bar. He pushed through a few reps pretty cleanly, but on the last one, his arms started shaking. I helped guide the bar back into the rack. He sat up and wiped his face with his shirt. "Appreciate it," he said. "How long have you been lifting?" "Couple years," I told him. That opened the door. He started asking the usual gym questions. What my split was, how many days a week I trained, what I was working that day. I answered casually while setting up my own set. He was friendly enough, just a little more talkative than most gym people. Before I started my set, he asked where I worked and if I lived nearby. I kept it vague and just said I lived a few minutes away. He smiled, like that was great news. "No way," he said. "I'm right around here too." Small world. I nodded and put my headphones back on, thinking the conversation was over. But before I lay back on the bench, he held his phone out toward me. "You got Instagram?" I hesitated for a second, but figured it wasn't a big deal. People add each other from the gym all the time. So I followed him back. After that, Trevor started talking to me more whenever we were both there. At first, it was harmless. He'd walk over between my sets and ask what I was training that day. Sometimes he'd comment on my form or suggest a different exercise variation. Not in a rude way, more like he was trying to be helpful. It was a little much, but nothing that seemed creepy. He'd also send me stuff on Instagram, mostly gym memes or clips of guys failing lifts in ridiculous ways. I'd react with a laughing emoji and leave it at that. I didn't think much of it. Then, one weekend, he messaged me asking if I wanted to check out a local street festival happening downtown. Food trucks, live music, beer tents, that kind of thing. I almost said no, but I didn't really have plans. And it sounded like a decent way to get out of the house, so I agreed. We met there in the afternoon. The first thing I noticed was that Trevor felt like a completely different person outside the gym. At the gym, he had this controlled, focused energy. At the festival, he was loud from the second I saw him. He walked up grinning and clapped me on the shoulder like we were old friends. "Evan, my man." I laughed awkwardly and said hey. Then, something weird started happening. He began talking in different voices. At first, I thought he was joking around, like doing impressions or something, but it didn't seem tied to anything. He just suddenly switched to a high-pitched voice mid-sentence, then go back to normal, then drop into this exaggerated, deep voice. It wasn't funny so much as confusing. We grabbed beers and walked through the crowd, and as he drank more, his behavior got stranger. He kept pointing at random people and making comments that were way too loud. Stuff you really shouldn't say around families. A couple times I told him to chill out. "Dude, people can hear you." He'd laugh and switch into one of those weird voices again, whispering my name, like he was in a horror movie. "Ivan." Then he'd crack up laughing. At first, I brushed it off as alcohol and social awkwardness. Some people just act weird when they drink. But after a couple hours, I started feeling uncomfortable. He kept saying my name in that drawn-out way. Not occasionally, constantly. Every story or joke started with it. Evan, listen to this. Evan, watch that guy. Evan, you gotta try this drink. There was something about the way he said it that felt off, like he enjoyed hearing himself say it. Eventually, I told him I had to head out. He looked disappointed but didn't argue much. I went home thinking he was strange, but probably harmless. After that, though, his messages increased. He started texting me almost every day. What are you up to? You going to the gym tonight? You want to grab food after? At first, I answered occasionally. Then, I slowed down. I'm not someone who likes constant messaging, especially with someone I barely know. One night, he invited me to a bar and said a couple girls he knew were meeting us there. That made it sound more normal, like a group thing. So, I agreed. When I got there, Trevor was already sitting at the bar with a drink in front of him. He looked a little buzzed. We ordered drinks and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. No one else showed up. I asked about the girls. He shrugged and said, "Guess they bailed." He said it so casually that I immediately got the feeling they were never actually coming. The rest of the night felt uncomfortable. The voices came back. Not just talking voices this time. Fake laughing. Fake crying. Weird, exaggerated sounds like he was acting out characters. People around us started glancing over. The bartender looked annoyed. Trevor seemed to notice the attention and leaned into it, getting louder and weirder. At one point, he ordered shots and tried to pressure me into taking them. When I refused, he did this mocking baby voice. Evan's no fun. That was the moment I decided I was leaving. I checked my phone and said I had to go help my brother with something. Trevor stared at me like he didn't believe it. "Why can't you just stay?" he asked. "I really can't," I said. His face tightened for a second. Then he did that fake laugh again. But this time, it sounded angry. I left. And on the drive home, I made a decision. I wasn't hanging out with him again. The next time I went to the gym, I tried avoiding him, but he spotted me almost immediately. He walked up smiling like nothing happened. "Hey man, why'd you leave so early the other night?" I gave the same excuse. He nodded but stayed beside me as I moved through my workout, station to station, conversation after conversation. It felt like he had decided I was his friend, whether I liked it or not. After that, I started changing my gym schedule. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And when I didn't see him, my phone would light up with messages. If I didn't respond, he'd send another. "You good? Everything okay?" Eventually, I just stopped opening his DMs altogether. Then, one night, something happened that made my stomach drop. I was lying in bed with my window cracked open because it was a hot summer night. My room faces the backyard. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard something outside. A voice, low and drawn out. It said my name, Evan. I froze. It sounded like someone trying to sound creepy on purpose. I sat up and listened. Silence. I walked to the window and carefully looked through the blinds. I didn't see anyone, but I had this strange feeling that someone had been standing there seconds earlier. Without really thinking, I whispered through the window, "Trevor." No response. I stepped back and grabbed my phone. A thought hit me that made my chest tighten. How would he even know where I lived? I'd never told him my address. Still, I opened Instagram and messaged him. "Are you outside my house?" The message showed as seen. A few minutes later. Those minutes felt way longer than they should have. Then he replied, "No." That was it. Just that one word. No confusion. No question about why I'd ask. Just no. The next night, it happened again. This time, the voice came from farther back in the yard, near the fence. Same drawn-out tone. "Evan." I jumped up and looked outside, but again, there was nothing there. That's when I lost my patience. I messaged Trevor again. I told him if he was coming near my house, he needed to stop immediately or I'd call the police. Then, I blocked him. I expected that to end it, but it didn't. Later that night, I lifted the blinds slightly to check outside, and that's when I saw him, a dark figure standing right outside the window, close enough that his silhouette blocked the faint light from the yard. I shouted for him to get out. The figure moved away quickly and disappeared into the darkness. After that, I didn't feel safe in my own room. I stopped going to that gym entirely, signed up at another one across town, kept my blinds shut every night. 3 weeks passed without anything happening. I started relaxing. Then, one morning, I walked out to my car and saw my rear tire was completely flat. When I crouched down, I saw the cut in the sidewall. A clean slice. Someone had slashed it. I looked up and down the street expecting to see Trevor watching from somewhere, but there was no one. That same day, I bought security cameras and installed them around my house. Motion lights, too. I kept my routines unpredictable after that. Different routes home, different grocery stores, anything to avoid patterns. The strangest part of all this was how normal it started. Just a guy from the gym, couple friendly conversations, 2 hangouts. That's it. And somehow, that was enough for him to decide we had some kind of connection. So if there's any lesson in this, it's this. Be careful who you let into your life, even casually, because sometimes the people who seem the most normal at first are the ones who quietly decide you belong to them. My name is Eric. I'm 23 years old, and I live in a medium-sized town in western Pennsylvania. I've been here most of my life. It's the kind of place where everybody kind of knows everybody, or at least knows someone who knows you. I work at a warehouse that ships auto parts. The job isn't exciting, but it pays decently and keeps me busy. Most of my routine is pretty simple. I work from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Grab dinner somewhere, then go to the gym. I've been going to the same gym for about 3 years. It's nothing fancy, just a 24-hour place with old equipment, rubber flooring, and the same group of regulars every night. My best friend Nate usually goes with me. He's 24 and works construction. We've known each other since high school, and lifting together kind of became our daily habit. We normally show up around 7:30 p.m., lift for an hour or so, then hang out in the parking lot for a bit before heading home. Last spring, Nate started dating this girl named Marissa. They met through a mutual friend. At first, she seemed pretty normal. I met her a couple times when we all grabbed food after the gym. She was quiet, but friendly. But after about a month, things started getting weird. Nate told me she hated that he went to the gym with me every night. She kept accusing him of ignoring her, or choosing the gym over their relationship. At first, we both kind of laughed it off. People get jealous sometimes. But it didn't stop. She started calling him constantly while we were working out. If he didn't answer right away, she'd send long messages, asking who he was with and what he was doing. One night, she actually showed up at the gym unannounced and sat in the lobby, staring at us. Until we finished, that was the first time I got a strange feeling about her. Eventually, Nate got tired of it. After a few arguments and a lot of stress, he broke up with her. He said the whole relationship just felt exhausting. She didn't take it well. For the next week, she kept texting him, asking for another chance. Then, the texts turned angry. Then they turned weird. She'd send messages late at night saying things like she knew where he was and that he shouldn't replace her with his gym friend. Nate blocked her number after that. Things were quiet for about 2 weeks, and we assumed she'd moved on. Then, one Thursday night, something happened at the gym. Nate and I got there around 7:45 like usual. The place wasn't very busy. There were maybe 5 other people scattered around the machines. We started with bench press and had just finished our second set when the front door opened. A woman walked in, wearing a gray hoodie and black leggings. At first, I didn't really pay attention. People come and go all the time. But then, I noticed she just stopped a few feet inside the door. She wasn't checking in or heading toward any equipment. She was just standing there, looking straight at us. It only lasted a few seconds, but something about it felt off. When she finally moved, she walked past us toward the locker rooms. As she passed, her head turned slightly, like she was making sure we were still there. Nate didn't notice at all. About 10 minutes later, we started hearing something from the women's locker room. At first, I thought it was someone on the phone, but then I realized it sounded like crying. Not normal crying either. It was quiet at first, then louder, like someone trying to hold it back but failing. Then, there was whispering. It sounded like someone talking to themselves. Nate pulled one earbud out and said, "Do you hear that?" I nodded. We both kind of shrugged it off and kept lifting, but it definitely made the whole gym feel uncomfortable. A few minutes later, the locker room door opened. The same girl came out. She was still wearing the exact same clothes. Usually, if someone goes into the locker room at a gym, they're changing or grabbing something before working out. But she didn't grab any equipment. She didn't stretch or warm up. She just started walking slowly around the gym. Every few minutes, she drifted closer to wherever Nate and I were working out. She never said anything. She just stood nearby, like she was waiting. At one point, Nate leaned over and quietly said, "Dude, is she watching us?" I looked over, and she immediately looked away. We switched machines and moved across the room. A few minutes later, she was standing near us again. That's when I started getting uncomfortable. After about 10 more minutes, I looked up and realized she was gone. Neither of us saw her leave. We finished our workout around 9 o'clock and went outside like we usually did. The parking lot was mostly empty, but one car was still sitting near the edge of the lot, with its headlights on. We didn't think much of it at the time. We talked for a few minutes, then went our separate ways. About 15 minutes after I got home, my phone buzzed. It was Nate. He asked, "You remember that girl at the gym tonight?" I said, "Yeah." Then he sent another message. What if that was Marissa? That made my stomach drop a little. I asked if he actually saw her face. He said not clearly, but the height and body type looked really similar. We both tried to convince ourselves it was probably just someone else. Around 11:20 that night, I was in my room watching videos when I heard a tapping sound. It was coming from my window. At first, I thought it might be a branch or something hitting the glass, but when I looked outside, nothing was there. About a minute later, it happened again. 3 slow taps. I walked to the window and looked down into the yard. Still, nothing. Then my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. The message said, "You should stop hanging around Nate." My stomach instantly tightened. Another text came through. "You're the reason he left me." Before I could even respond, I heard something outside. A soft laugh. It came from somewhere near the front of the house. I walked quietly into the hallway and looked through the front window. At first, I didn't see anyone. Then I noticed someone sitting on the curb across the street. A girl in a gray hoodie. She was just sitting there, looking directly at my house. My phone buzzed again. Another message. "You shouldn't have gotten involved." Then a photo came through. It was taken outside in the dark. And in the picture was a kitchen knife being held in someone's hand. Right then, I heard footsteps on the front porch. Then the door handle started rattling. Not gently, violently. Whoever was outside was trying to force it open. I immediately called my dad, who was downstairs watching TV. He grabbed his phone and called the police while I stayed in my room. The door shaking stopped after about 30 seconds. Then, everything went quiet. The police showed up about 10 minutes later. When they searched the yard, they found her sitting behind our neighbor's car across the street. It was Marissa. She didn't even try to run. She just sat there, smiling, while the officers handcuffed her. They later told us she admitted to going to the gym earlier that night and following Nate's car afterward to see where he went. Then, she followed me home. I pressed charges. I haven't seen her since. But sometimes, when I think about that night, one thing still bothers me. Nate never told her where I lived, which means she must have been watching us a lot longer than we realized. I'm 25 now, but this happened when I was about 23. At the time, I had just started my first full-time job after finishing college, and my routine was pretty simple. Work from 9 to 5, grab a quick dinner, then head to the gym around 6 in the evening. I'd been going to the same gym for a couple of years, so by then, it had become a regular part of my day. It was one of those medium-sized chain gyms you find in most towns. Nothing fancy, just rows of treadmills, some weight machines, a squat rack area, and a small stretching section with mats near the mirrors. Around 6 in the evening, it was always pretty busy. Not packed, but enough people that you'd start recognizing the same faces after a while. There were the usual regulars, a guy who always wore the same red hoodie on the treadmill, a couple who lifted together every single night, an older man who spent almost an hour stretching before he even touched a weight. You never really talked to these people, but you knew them. About 6 or 7 months before I stopped going there, I started noticing someone new. The first time I remember seeing him clearly was during one of my leg days. I was doing squats in front of the large mirror near the rack. Between sets, I usually looked up at the mirror to check my form. During one of those breaks, I noticed a guy sitting on the chest press machine, behind me. He wasn't using it. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, staring straight ahead, like he was just resting. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Lots of people sit between sets. But when I started my next set and looked up again, he was still in the exact same position. The weights hadn't moved. What stood out was that he seemed to be looking directly at me, through the mirror. The moment our eyes met, he immediately turned his head away, like he'd been caught doing something. It was a little weird, but not enough for me to think much about it. The next time I saw him was a couple days later. I was using the shoulder press machine across the room. After a few minutes, I noticed him again, this time sitting at the lat pull-down station, just like before. The weight stack wasn't moving. He was just sitting there, and again, every time I glanced in that direction, I caught him looking at me before he quickly turned away. At first, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was just zoning out between sets, or resting longer than usual. But over the next couple of weeks, I kept noticing him almost every time I came to the gym. And the strange thing was that I never actually saw him work out, not once. He would always be sitting somewhere, on a bench, on a machine, near the dumbbells, but the weights never moved. It started to feel like he wasn't there to exercise at all. One night, things got a little more uncomfortable. I was doing squats again in the same rack. Between sets, I looked up at the mirror like usual and saw him standing farther back behind the machines. This time, he was holding his phone. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People check their phones all the time at the gym, but after a few seconds, I noticed the way he was holding it. It wasn't down by his side. It was up in front of his chest, and it was angled directly toward me. For a split second, it honestly looked like he was recording. The moment I stopped and stared at him through the mirror, he quickly lowered the phone and looked away, like nothing had happened. That was the first time I actually felt uneasy. After that night, I started paying attention to him more. Once you start looking for something, it's hard to stop noticing it. And the pattern became obvious. No matter where I was in the gym, he always seemed to be somewhere with a clear view of me. If I was in the free weight section, he'd be sitting on a nearby bench. If I moved to the machines, he'd eventually show up somewhere across the room. He never approached me, never said a word, but watching, never stopped. One evening, something happened that really stuck with me. I had finished my workout and walked toward the water fountain near the locker rooms. It's tucked around a corner where you can't really see who's coming from the other side. As I turned the corner, I almost ran straight into someone. It was him. He was standing only a few feet away, closer than I had ever seen him before. He looked up for a brief second, clearly surprised that I had turned the corner. Then, he immediately looked down and stepped aside without saying anything. He walked past me quickly toward the exit. The whole interaction lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it left me with a strange feeling I couldn't shake. After that, I decided to change my schedule. Instead of going at 6 like I normally did, I started going around 9 at night. The gym is a lot quieter then, and I figured if he had a normal routine, he probably wouldn't be there that late. The first night I tried it, I walked in and immediately scanned the room. He wasn't there. The next night was the same, and the night after that, for the first time in weeks, I started to relax again. I figured maybe he had just been another regular whose schedule happened to overlap with mine for a while. But then, something happened that completely changed how I looked at the whole situation. One Saturday night, a couple friends and I went downtown to a bar. It was crowded and loud, like most places on a weekend. We were standing near the back of the room talking, when I happened to glance toward one of the small tables along the wall, and I froze. He was sitting there, the same guy from the gym. He was alone at a small round table, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. At first, I thought maybe I was mistaken, but then he looked up, and I recognized him instantly. He was staring directly at me. The second he realized I had noticed him, he looked down at his drink like he had just been casually glancing around the room. Over the next 15 minutes, I caught him looking at me several more times. Each time, he would quickly turn his head away. Eventually, I leaned toward my friends and told them I wanted to leave. I didn't explain why. I just said I wasn't feeling the place. We left and went to another bar a few blocks away. I didn't see him again that night, but after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The gym was one thing, but seeing him somewhere completely unrelated made everything feel different. The scariest moment happened about 2 weeks later. There's a nature preserve not too far from where I live. It has a long dirt trail that winds through the woods, and sometimes I like to run there in the afternoon. It was a cloudy day when I started my run. About 10 minutes in, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, that didn't seem strange. People jogged there all the time. But after a minute or two, I noticed something odd. The distance between us wasn't changing. Whoever was behind me was keeping the exact same pace. I sped up a little. Within seconds, the footsteps sped up too. I slowed slightly. They slowed too. It felt deliberate. Finally, I glanced back over my shoulder. The person behind me was wearing a dark hat, with their head slightly down. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the build looked familiar. Very familiar. That was when my stomach dropped. About 30 seconds ahead, there's a small dirt path that branches off the main trail and leads up to a residential street. I suddenly decided I didn't want to stay on the main trail anymore. I started running faster. Within seconds, the footsteps behind me got louder. He was speeding up too. I broke into a full sprint. So did he. The sound of his shoes hitting the dirt path behind me got closer and closer. When I reached the small side trail, I turned sharply and ran straight toward the street as fast as I could. The moment I hit the pavement, I started yelling. A man standing in a driveway across the road immediately looked over. The second the person behind me saw someone else nearby, he stopped at the edge of the trail. I turned around just in time to see him hesitate for a moment. Then, he turned and ran back into the woods. He disappeared within seconds. The man from the driveway walked over to check on me while I stood there trying to catch my breath. By the time I looked back toward the trail, whoever it was had completely vanished. After that day, I never saw the guy again. Not at the gym, not anywhere. A few weeks later, I canceled my membership and joined a gym across town. Nothing like that has happened since. But that experience permanently changed how aware I am of the people around me in public. Now, when I'm somewhere regularly, I notice patterns. Who's there? Who's watching? And more importantly, who isn't really there for the reason everyone else is?